Hey there, Exiles. It's Everseen here. Are you still dying to degens or don't even know what degens are? Basically, degens are degenerative effects that will happen to your character over time. Although they're called degens, they should really be called dot or damage over time. Basically, I'm going to teach you in this video some of the mitigation tactics that I personally use for hardcore, as well as some common scenarios that you will face in the world of Rayclast. Disclaimer though, I'm not covering every avenue or option in the game. It would take hours upon hours to go over everything, but as always, if I missed anything that you feel is critically important, don't be afraid to suggest anything in the comments and we can just teach everybody together. We'll go over some of the most common degenerative effects first, like poison and bleed, as well as some of the tricks to mitigate them or to achieve immunity. I'm going to cover bosses as well that have popular degen effects like ground degen effects to understand, or even just like ignite, for example. And lastly, we'll talk about some items, passives, and ascendancies that can significantly help with degens. Enjoy. To start, let's go over bleeding. Bleed is a physical damage over time effect that worsens as you move your character. The most common way to mitigate the moving portion is by using the Ralakesh Minor Pantheon. The upgraded effect of Ralakesh also helps to limit corrupted blood stacks, so the effect is not as lethal. Ralakesh is great to mitigate the moving portion, but that doesn't account for the bleed that gets inflicted. It may be more beneficial to target bleed immunity through other avenues so that you may use another minor Pantheon. Flasks are a key way to mitigate bleed by using the immunity to bleed and corrupting blood mod on your flasks. In addition to this, we can use the flask enchant crafted on the crafting bench to use this flask when we start to bleed. The Armour and Evasion Mastery is another clever way to get immunity to either bleed or poison. If you are using a hybrid Armour and Evasion helmet like the Pigface Bassinet, you can have bleed immunity with the mastery allocated. Another way to achieve bleed immunity is by using Steel Skin. You can link this with automation, but keep in mind that only one guard skill can be used at a time and they all share cooldowns. There are many sources of chance to avoid bleed in the game. You can achieve chance to avoid bleeding from the Eater Implicit on boots. There's also the Evasion Mastery, Cluster Jewels, Tattoos, Abyss Jewels, and many others. Typically, you're going to want immunity, but if you can't achieve that, you can alternatively go for additional physical damage reduction from sources like the suffix on a chest piece or by using endurance charges in your build. Now let's go over poison. Poison at its basis is chaos damage over time, and realistically, I myself haven't had too much trouble with poison. Poison is really only dangerous when you have multiple stacks of poison inflicted on your character at once. As long as you have capped chaos resistance, it's really not a huge issue. The same knowledge for bleed can be applied for poison though. For the Pantheon, the Arakali Major Pantheon is by far the best mitigation. This Pantheon also doubles at being effective against all damage over time, not just poison. The Minor Pantheon, Shikari, can also be used to have 50% less duration of poisons on you, and you cannot have more than 3 poison stacks on you. The upgraded portion also helps with reduced chaos damage and less damage taken over time from Caustic Ground. Flasks are a key way to mitigate poison as well by using the immunity to poison suffix mod on your flasks. We can also use the same principle as bleed for the enchant to use the flask when we get poisoned. You can find chance to avoid poison in all of the same areas mentioned for bleed. Corrupted blood is our next topic. Ideally, you want to prioritize getting immunity to this buff at all times. Primary example for me saying this is by doing the Sirus fight. If he inflicts corrupted blood on your character, it is a very large amount of degenerative effect. Getting immunity to this ailment will make your overall gameplay experience much more enjoyable. So let's go over some ways to achieve that. As stated previously, Ralakesh is a good way to mitigate, but achieving immunity is always much better. Personally, I always go for a corrupted jewel implicit that states corrupted blood cannot be inflicted on you, or I go for the protection mastery that states the exact same thing. As I stated with bleeding, additional physical damage reduction on either the chest piece or through endurance charges will help mitigate corrupted blood if you don't have immunity. Another ailment that does damage over time is Ignite. Normally, Ignite is not a huge issue except for the Maven or Searing Exarch fight. Since Ignite is based off the initial damage of the hit, the more damage that you do, the bigger the Ignite will be. So that's why bosses tend to do the most Ignite damage. Ignite immunity can easily be found through the Purity of Elements aura, but if you're not using that, you can go for some Ignite Elemental Ailment Avoidance on the passive tree, and the Searing Exarch implicit on boots. If you happen to be playing an Ascendant or Chieftain, you can also achieve Ignite immunity through their passives. Storm Shroud is also a way to achieve Elemental Ailment immunity. By stacking 100% chance to avoid shock, you will get immunity to all Elemental ailments. Another jewel that can be used is Ancestral Vision. If you have 100% chance to suppress spell damage, you can easily get 50% chance to avoid Elemental ailments. By traversing through the thick skin wheel on the passive tree, that is another 20% chance to avoid elemental ailments with life. You can use the Eater of Worlds implicit on a pair of boots to get some more, and alternatively, Crystal Skin on the passive tree can give you the remaining 30% chance to avoid elemental ailments. So now let's touch on some ground effects. Typically, ground effects really hurt your character when they out-sustain regeneration done by your character. And if you have no regeneration, the DEGEN is going to do significantly more damage to your character. The most obvious way to combat ground effects is by using life regeneration, since it will regenerate your life simultaneously while it's degenerated. Easier said than done though, because some DEGENs in the game are so severe and do so much base damage that you will need some type of mitigation along with life regeneration. Starting off with the basics though, let's chat about Burning Ground and Caustic Ground. Burning Ground is fire damage taken over time while standing on it. This can obviously be mitigated with fire resistance and life regeneration. You can go for the Aberrath Minor Pantheon to be unaffected by Burning Ground with the upgraded portion. You can also find unaffected by Burning Ground through Shaper or Warlord influenced boots. Caustic Ground is chaos damage taken over time while standing on it. Having capped chaos resistance is crucial for this. As stated before, if you're really having an issue, you can go for the upgraded Shikari Minor Pantheon to have 25% reduced damage taken over time while standing on Caustic Ground. As long as you have capped chaos resistance and life regeneration, Caustic Ground really shouldn't be an issue for your build. There are a couple rare monster modifier degens that you'll see, one being the Mana Siphoner, Thorn Vines, and Toxic. Mana Siphoner has a blue ring around the mob that does lightning damage over time and siphons your mana. However, if you stand directly beside the enemy, you don't take any damage at all. Thorn Vines is basically chaos damage taken over time, and it will slow you and disable your movement skills. So having chaos resistance, which you should have already, and life regeneration is good enough to deal with this. Toxic will have 3 toxic volatiles that will chase your character until they are above your head. They will then plummet and have Caustic Ground when they hit. It's best to just avoid these or have capped chaos resistance. So now let's talk about popular ground degens that you will encounter, primarily while bossing. After explaining all of them, we will go over passives, Pantheon, and gear to combat them. The first is the Shaper Vortex. These do cold damage over time to your character and can be really deadly. Another move to watch out for is the Shaper Beam. This will do fire, cold, and lightning damage over time. This has a very high base damage and is tough to mitigate. The next fight to talk about is the Sirus fight. There will be storms in the Sirus fight that do 50% physical, 25% fire, and 25% chaos damage. They have very high base damage, so this is hard to mitigate. There are also Meteor Geysers that will be in the arena with you that do physical, fire, and chaos damage over time. There are also DEGEN puddles in the synth maps. Venarius will cast Quicksand DEGEN puddles, which do heavy physical damage over time. Finally, the last example of DEGEN puddles I have is from the Maven fight. The brain will shoot out 3 projectiles that will chase you and expand into DEGEN puddles once they have come into contact with your character. These will do cold damage over time, similarly to the Shaper Vortexes. One thing to note about DEGEN puddles is that the damage does not stack. The damage will stay the same, so that's why you want to have them stacked on top of each other while you're doing either the Shaper or Maven fight, for instance. I know I definitely didn't cover everything, but now that we've got some examples of damage over time, let's talk about how to mitigate it. Like previously mentioned, life regeneration is going to help with degeneration and can be used in conjunction with other mitigation tactics. Another form of regeneration that can help significantly is Consecrated Ground. This can be achieved from a Sulphur Flask and as well through the Inquisitor Ascendancy. Taking Devotion on the passive tree can also give 25% increased effect to Consecrated Ground that you create. Consecrated Ground will give you 5% life regeneration and 50% reduced effective curses at its base value. Bottled Faith is a unique Sulphur Flask that will give you 40% increased damage and Consecrated Ground on use. Although it's quite expensive, this is one of the best ways to mitigate degens. Lethe Shade is a keystone on the passive tree that is probably the strongest possible mitigator for damage over time. It states that you take 50% less damage over time if you have taken damage over time in the past second. The downside of this, however, is that you will have 100% increased duration of ailments on you, aka like bleed or poison or ignite. Now, if you followed along, I have given countless tactics to achieve ailment immunity, so this downside shouldn't really be that bad because you should have it mitigated. The next biggest mitigating factor is going to be the Arakali Major Pantheon. The basis of it is you get 10% less damage taken over time, but the upgraded effects are really good. You get some extra regeneration when you've stopped taking damage over time, and you can get 40% to chaos resistance against damage over time. Debuffs expiring faster is also a great thing to have. The Heartstopper, notable for the Trickster, can also give 40% reduced damage taken over time for 5 seconds, but the downside for this is that it only happens once every 10 seconds, so there is not 100% uptime. Another Ascendancy notable that can work is Withering Presence on the Occultist. This notable is a bit more conditional, and it states that nearby hindered enemies deal 15% reduced damage over time. Maximum resistances are going to help significantly if you are taking an elemental damage over time. Having 90% maximum elemental resistance to an elemental degen will significantly reduce its effectiveness. Additional physical damage reduction is a very good way to mitigate physical damage over time. Remember, endurance charges are very good for this, and the suffix on a chest piece. It's important to note with damage over time that it cannot be converted. It's best to mitigate with ways of getting reduced damage over time, and there are a few uniques that can help with damage over time. Some are more viable to wear than others, like using Doppelganger's Guise for reduced physical and chaos damage taken, or using Solaris Lorica to take 25% reduced chaos damage taken over time. You can also get corrupted implicits on body armors that can give either reduced fire, cold, lightning, or chaos damage. One of my personal favorites for mitigation is the Eternal Damnation Amulet. This amulet has a downside of -5 to maximum resistances, but the upside completely mitigates this downside. Your maximum elemental resistances can be easily scaled back up to 75% through masteries and eldritch implicits. If your character has at least 70% chaos resistance, this amulet will provide an additional reduction of 35% to elemental resistances, making it my #1 pick for not only elemental degens, but as well as penetration. And that's going to do it for today's video, guys. I used PoE Wiki along with PoEDB to source all the information given here. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe, please. I'd really appreciate it, and I'll be doing more educational content in the future. I also stream on Twitch every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9 AM Eastern if you want to come hang out and maybe ask a few questions there. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you in the next one. Later.